Hey there. Thanks for tuning in. You ready for another episode of My Bigfoot Sighting? Alright then, let's do this.
Seen a bunch of run-down no-horse towns where the church is the backbone, loves in the plow, and the five-string melodies grooving, with the farmland rows where the roots run deep, beyond the noise of the busy streets, where the songs of the South are soothing. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Yeah.
My Bigfoot sightings all happen in Switzerland County, Indiana. When I was a kid, we moved around to several places in Indiana. We lived in Indianapolis when I was younger, but about the age of 8 in 1995, we moved to Switzerland County, Indiana. And it wasn't too many years after that I started hunting with my dad. My dad had always been a hunter, and I had always wanted to be out in the woods with him, but I obviously had to wait until I was old enough to be able to do so. But I've been out in the woods hunting ever since I was able to. The area we hunt in is not open to the public. It's private property. But there are plenty of people within that private property that hunt that land. And I've never heard any other accounts from any of the other hunters or any of my dad's friends, my dad himself. No one else has seemed to have seen anything out here. And it's kind of troubling, honestly. Now, I've been studying Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it, for years. I'm very interested in cryptids and dogman sightings and other things like that. But, in researching all of this stuff, you hear accounts that seem very natural. Like, something was throwing stones at me, or I heard whooping noises in the woods, whatever. But then you hear accounts where there are strange lights in the sky and other things like that. And it kind of takes the Bigfoot phenomena into another realm when you start talking about lights in the sky and psychic messages and different things that you've heard people talking about as far as Bigfoot is concerned. You've got your more natural encounters, and you've got your more supernatural encounters. And just being the only person that I know of that's been out there to this private property, and being the only person who's seen anything out there, it just blows my mind. I don't know how else to describe it. There's not a lot of hunters out there, but there's a good handful of 5 or 6 guys that have been out in those woods since before I was born, probably. And none of them have ever reported anything. It's just strange. But I started hunting with my dad when I was about 12, I guess, whenever you can get your hunting license. And I had gone out to those woods with my dad plenty of times before. I mean, just because you don't have a hunting license doesn't mean that you can't go out in the woods. I used to go out with him all the time and just sit with him while he hunted and kind of learn things. And I never had any encounters when I was with my father. Something else that I think is important to note in this is that the place where we hunted at is private property. I don't want to give away the name of the place where we hunted at. Only certain, family friends and stuff like that were allowed to go out there and hunt. So there was a small handful of us that were able to go out there. My dad and a few of his friends and their kids, it was kind of a legacy thing. And even before we had moved to Swits, I still went out there with my dad quite a few times. He would just take me hunting with him so I could see what it was all about and sit out there with him and just see how it's done, basically. But I didn't start hunting with him until I was probably about 12 or so, or however old it is that you got to be to get a hunting license at that age. We would go out there and spend weekends or sometimes even a week going on hunting trips. When you came into the compound, as I called it, you went down this gravel road. You had to go over this bridge that stretched over a creek, and this creek was famous for a man had died during a storm. There was a terrible storm, and his Jeep got washed over the side of the bridge, and he drowned there. That creek was known for that. But, you pass over this bridge down this gravel road, and there's several compounds down there. The property where we hunted at, it was butted up against a couple of other properties, the nearest of which was, still is, a hunting resort for police officers. And basically what I'm getting at is a ton of land out there, thousands of acres, and it's all private property, just 1, 2, 3 stacked up against each other, just a massive amount of land for something large to be moving around in. But, I started hunting with my dad, and then I actually started going out on my own. We would go on hunting trips, where I was able to hunt when I was finally old enough. And that's when I started noticing strange things out in those woods. And as I was getting at before, it's kind of weirded me out, the fact that there were so many people coming out into these woods, but I was the only person who had encountered anything. Now, granted, I hadn't talked to a lot of people about this. I wasn't going to talk to my dad about it because I was too embarrassed. My dad is not the type of person who believes in supernatural or Bigfoot or, anything of that sort. My dad is a 100% non-believer. I think even if a ghost walked up to that man and shook his hand, he still wouldn't believe in ghosts. Like, he doesn't believe in Bigfoot or any of that stuff. And, I didn't want to say anything to any of the other hunters because, once again, I was too embarrassed. And just throughout the years, thinking back on all of this, it's kind of messed with me in my head how I'm the only one who's ever encountered anything out there. Let's see, I think the first time I encountered anything, I was 19 years old. It was 2006. And we were headed out to our different hunting spots that morning, me and my dad. It was, I think, like 4:30 in the morning when we woke up and started getting ready, started getting all of our gear together and getting dressed up and spraying stuff all over ourselves to get the scent off of us. There's different sprays and stuff to camouflage yourself from deer. And, we were just doing our routine as we were getting ready to head out into the woods. That was about 4:30 in the morning. And then, we parted ways, and my dad went towards his trail and I went toward my trail. It's a big area out there, and one of the first spots that you'll hit when you're walking into the woods is something that we call the scum pond. It's just a small little pond, and it's covered in algae, and the top of the water's green and stuff. We call it scum pond. And my trail was just beyond the scum pond, leading further into the woods, and that was going to lead me down a path and to several ravines where my tree stand spot was at. So that morning, I was walking into the woods. It was bow season, and I had my bow and arrow. Even though it was dark out, I had an arrow knocked, ready to go, ready to fire, just in case, I spooked a deer or came up on something. You never know. It's just something I was taught. When you're walking to your stand, always have an arrow knocked and ready to go. I can't recall exactly how far I was into the woods. It had been probably 10 minutes on the trail after leaving the compound. So I had my bow and arrow in my hands, and to be able to see in the darkness, I had a headlamp. And I was walking down the trail, and then all of a sudden, all the hairs on the back of my neck stood up straight. And just as soon as I got that startled feeling, that's when the smell hit me. I smelled something. The only way I could really describe it is it reminded me of like if you took a wet dog and a laundry basket full of dirty football uniforms and just threw it all together, like just wet dog and body odor. It was such a pungent smell. And it hit me too, like a wall. It hit me. And I got freaked out instantly because I thought that I had jumped a skunk. Being out in the woods, especially when it's dark out, you never know what you're gonna, come across, what you're gonna stir up. And living out there in the country, I had plenty of encounters with skunks. My dog had gotten sprayed by skunks so many times at that point, I couldn't even remember. We just called it getting skunked when you got sprayed by a skunk. But this smell was different, though. It was as pungent, but it didn't smell like a skunk. It smelled like nothing I've ever smelled before. It didn't smell like dead, rotting meat or anything. Being a hunter and being out in the woods, you get familiar with the smell of death, and that's not what it was. So it wasn't a rotting carcass. It wasn't a skunk. But it smelled like something I'd never smelled before. And I kind of paused on the trail. And I had my bow and arrow in my hand, as I said. And then I kind of just started scanning the trees with my headlamp. And I looked from left to right, right to left, up and down, just kind of scanning the area where I was at. And then I heard a branch snap. But it wasn't on the ground. It was higher up. Probably about, I don't know, it sounded like it was 7 or 8 feet up. It was clearly a branch snapping off of a tree. It wasn't something that was being stepped on the ground. And that was maybe, I don't know, 50 feet away from me, if not less. Like, it was loud and I could hear it. And I'm smelling this smell, and then I hear this snap. And the snap happened off to the left of me in the darkness. And then that's when I panned my headlamp over that way. And I hollered out, is anybody out there? Hey, hey, is anybody there? And I didn't hear anything. And then I started really focusing in on the foliage. And through the leaves and the branches and stuff, it was very dark, but my headlamp had good wattage on it, and the beam of light was very bright. Through the branches, about, I don't know, 40, 50 feet in front of me and off to the left, I could see fur or hair or, same thing basically, but I mean, I could see it moving behind these branches. And then I hollered out again. I said, hey, and it stopped. And it was so still, and it just stood there. And I was shaking at this point. Like, the smell had hit me. I grew up with Discovery Channel and cable and all that. I had seen all the Bigfoot shows and everything, and I knew about how they stunk and how big they were and stuff like that, and it was running through my head. I was like, there is no way I'm seeing what I'm seeing. There's no way I'm smelling what I'm smelling. It's got to be a dead animal or something. Or maybe it's just a really powerful skunk. Like, I just kept telling myself in my head as it was happening that it wasn't happening. And I kept focusing my light on this thing. And as I said, it was still. Like, it didn't move an inch. And I kind of dialed in. I don't know how to describe it. Like, everything else around me seemed to fade away for a second, and I just kind of dialed in on what I was doing, like tunnel vision. I don't know how to describe it, but my eyes were still adjusting in the darkness. All I have is this beam of light coming off of my headlamp, and it's being broken up by foliage and twigs and stuff. But I can see this fur. It's dark brown, thick fur on this thing. And so I'm kind of scanning the area directly on and around this thing to try to see how big it is, or if there are more than one of them. I scan my light further to the left and then over to the right, and I didn't see anything, but I was also kind of in a panic, so there's no telling. But then I focused my light back in the middle there, off to the left where I'd been looking, and I could still see the fur through the foliage. And now I started scanning up and down to see how tall this thing was. I couldn't see where it began. I couldn't see any feet or anything down to the ground. These woods get so thick during hunting season. It's ridiculous. I started scrolling up or not scrolling, but panning up with, and looking, and I could just see little bits of fur, dark brown fur, coming out from behind the leaves and stuff. And it was like it was kind of sandwiched between two trees almost. But as I scanned up and down with my light, I started to notice a loud breathing sound. As I said, I was like really dialed in at this point. And so I was ignoring all the forest sounds around me. And all I could hear was this deep breathing. But it wasn't like an in and out. It was just almost like loud exhales. Like, almost like snorts. Like a... And I don't know if it was making that noise because it was trying to alert me that it was there. I don't know how I was able to walk up on this thing, honestly, because from what I understand about Bigfoot or Sasquatch are that they're very elusive and that they will not reveal themselves to people on purpose. Not unless there's some sort of a standing relationship between that Sasquatch and that person. I've heard of things like that. I know they have their own language, and I've heard recordings of Sasquatch talking with people. I believe all that stuff, but that's not what I was hearing. I was just hearing just deep breathing through these trees. And I can't tell you how tall this thing was, but my mind registered, my eyes registered probably the tallest tuft of fur that I saw sticking out from behind those leaves. It was probably about 6 or 7 feet. And yeah, I just kind of stood there and I didn't know what to do. I was going through all of these scenarios in my mind and thinking about things that I had heard on TV and this and that, and the smell was getting to me as well. And I hollered out again. I said, "Hey, this is private property." And honestly, I turned around and I went back down the trail. I couldn't go any further. I didn't hunt that day. I went back to the camp, and I made up some story to my dad. I told him something about I had gotten lost. I had walked onto the wrong trail or something like that, and I couldn't find my tree stand. And so I told him I missed out on that morning's hunt. And I did that with the purpose of my dad walking me back out there to retrieve my tree stand. Because he knew where the spot was because he'd been hunting there for so long, but I was still learning the land. And when we went back, it was later on that day. During the daytime, during the daylight, and we went to go retrieve my stand. And yeah, I basically, I didn't want to tell my dad what was going on or what I had seen because I didn't think he'd believe me. And I definitely didn't want to go out there by myself, not after seeing what I had seen. And, it wasn't, I didn't feel threatened per se. I mean, I've heard other accounts where people were absolutely threatened. There was growling and tree knocking and stones being thrown and all this and that. I didn't feel threatened in the moment, but it was more of just when you come across something that isn't supposed to exist, or even just something you can't explain, just the unknown in general is terrifying. And, needless to say, I didn't tell anybody, my dad or any of our hunting friends, what I saw that day. It was already embarrassing enough to admit that I had gotten lost, even though I didn't. But, I had to do what I had to do. But that was the first real encounter. The second time I had anything happen was, it was probably, I don't know, a few weeks after that. We were back out there, and I was sitting in my tree stand in the afternoon. It was probably about 12:30, 1 o'clock. There had just been a slight rain that day, and you could hear the water dropping off of the branches, and nature kind of retreats momentarily when it rains, but then it comes back out full force when the sun comes back out, and you could just kind of hear all the squirrels and the birds and stuff starting to come back out and be active and stuff like that. And then I heard whooping. I'm not the best impressionist, but it was kind of a whoop, whoop kind of noise, but it was deeper. And that rung out from behind me, behind the position where I was sitting in my tree stand, like several yards behind me, if not more. Like, it was a ways away. And then a couple of seconds went by, and I was just sitting there listening. I was kind of confused from hearing the first whoop, but then in front of me and off to the right over this ridge, I heard a response. It was similar to what I'd heard before, but just a little different. I don't know. It was like just a different tone in the whoop, but I could tell it was a response. And, I'm a country boy and a hunter, and haven't been out in the woods as much as I have. You know what the sounds of the woods are. You know what animals are out there, and you know what sounds they make. And this was something that I'd never heard before. So I sat there and I listened, and I didn't hear anything else for, God, I don't know. It was probably 2 hours or so. And I was actually starting to doze off in my tree stand at that point. I wasn't having a very good hunting day. There wasn't much deer activity going on. And I was sitting there kind of dozing off, and then I heard another whoop. This one started in front of me, like the one before had when it replied. And it went whoop. I don't know how to do that faithfully, but it stood me, straight up in my seat when I heard it. And then just a couple seconds later, I heard a response This time it wasn't behind me. It was more off to the left and probably a few hundred yards off down another ridge. But it communicated back. And then the one in front of me went whoop again. And then the one off to the left went whoop. And there's differences in the whooping. I can't do it, but you could tell that they were saying things to each other. So that was an interesting day. I also forgot to mention there were a few times that I found tracks. After that first encounter that I talked about when I was heading to my tree stand, and I came across this thing in the darkness, and it stunk and everything. When I got my dad to go out there with me to retrieve my tree stand, and we were coming on our way back, I made up an excuse to go off the trail for a second. And I looked around that area where I had encountered that thing. Because it was just right off the trail and just into the woods just a little bit. Like, it wasn't far off the trail. Even in the darkness, I knew that. And I went over to that area, and I was looking for tracks. I don't know what I told my dad I was looking for, but I didn't find anything. But being a hunter and tracking deer and looking for deer, and you look for footprints, and you spend a lot of your time with your eyes glued to the ground. And there were some times when I was out once again by myself, sometimes trailing a deer, sometimes just, I didn't always hunt in a tree stand. Sometimes I would make a blind out of some fallen foliage and, just kind of sit up against a tree. Some days I spend all day in one spot, but some days if I get bored and nothing's happening, I'll get up and I'll move and I'll go see if I can jump something up or just find a new spot or find some tracks that lead somewhere. You never know. There's all kinds of possibilities out in the woods. So, I was out following a deer trail, and I actually got myself lost. I followed this deer trail all the way off the property. I believe I was in one of the neighboring properties, probably the one that was owned by the police officers. But as I was tracking these prints, I started coming across indentions in the mud that were unlike anything else. I didn't find any full prints, but I found like some heel marks on certain parts of some trails and leading into the woods. I found some, what I think were toe impressions in some parts of the mud. And in other parts, there were just deep imprints, but they were in the shape of feet, but I can't say that there were any toe marks or anything. So there's no telling. Those could have been boot marks, but the way they were so deeply imprinted into the mud led me to believe that it wasn't anything human that left those tracks. And unfortunately, I didn't cast any of those prints. I found plenty of them out there in those woods, and I really should have cast some of them, but I was out there to hunt, and I didn't want anybody to know what I was experiencing anyway, so I just I don't know, casting the prints just it didn't seem like an option to me at that time. Now looking back on it, I really wish I would have. All of these encounters actually happened in the same year, the same hunting season. The last time that I encountered anything out there, I was once again in my tree stand. I was in a different part of the property. I was actually on the opposite side of the property from where I had been before. And I was sitting in my tree stand, just kind of listening to the nature and everything. And then I heard what I thought sounded like twigs snapping, something moving through the woods. It sounded like it was on the trail that was directly beneath my stand. And it definitely sounded bigger than a squirrel or something like that. You know, there had been plenty of times when I thought a deer was coming up on me and I heard, you know, rustling about and twigs snapping and stuff, and it just turned out to be a turkey or a squirrel or, you know, something like that. But either way, when you're hunting and you hear something coming your way, you sit up in attention, and, you know, that could be your potential kill for the day. And so I took out my binoculars and I started kind of scanning the area around me. And I checked the trail. There was nothing coming down the trail, animals or people, nothing. And, yeah, you know, I thought, it must have been an animal or, you know, whatever. It's not a deer. So I had just, you know, been kind of woken up from dozing off. And so I was kind of sitting there trying to, you know, get my eyes adjusted and just kind of wake up and, you know, get back into hunting mode. And I sat there for a while, and I don't know, it must have been 15, 20 minutes. And then I heard more twig snapping. And I got out my binoculars again, and I started scanning the area again. And then, you know, I heard more and more of the snap, like something was walking around at this point. And I caught just out of the corner of my eye a glimpse of something dark amongst the foliage. And this was probably, God, I don't know, a couple hundred yards in front of me and off to the left, a little ways in between these two ridges, where there's this spot where these two ridges met, and there was a little stream running in between the two of them. And I saw, and this is broad daylight, I saw this thing once again a few hundred yards ahead of me, little to the left of my straightforward view. This thing was in between these two ridges, crouched behind a tree, and it was looking at something. It didn't even know that I was there. I don't think it did. I kind of scanned the area to see what it was looking at. And then as I was doing that, I heard some more movement up at the top of the ridge. And I looked up there, and there was this huge doe standing up on top of this ridge. And she was way out of my range for me to be able to bag her. But I kind of, I didn't even think about shooting her because she was out of range. So I didn't even bother to get anything ready or any of that. I just kind of watched. And then I moved my binoculars back over to this thing that was in between the ridges. And just from the time that I had moved away from it and looked at the deer and came back, it was already halfway up that ridge. And the only reason I was able to see it the second time when I panned back around is because it was moving up behind another tree. And I caught it with my peripheral. This thing was going after the deer. And I don't know, I didn't want to take my binoculars off of it, but I also wanted to see where the deer was at. So I would keep my binoculars fixed on the Bigfoot or, whatever. And then I would remove my eyes away from the binoculars and look up the ridge because I could see the deer with my naked eyes. But I didn't want to move the position of my binoculars away from this thing because I didn't want to lose it. And I kind of watched it for a second. It was creeping up this ridge, and it was so quiet. I know how loud these woods can be with all the fallen trees and twigs and foliage and everything. And somehow this thing was managing to be so stealthy. And it was big. From where I was sitting, it was crouched down. Most of the time, it was at a certain point, it was bent down on one knee with both of its hands on the ground as well in front of it. But I saw it stand up a couple of times to gain ground up the side of this ridge, and it was absolutely massive. This thing had to have been easily 10 feet tall. Just from what I could tell from the trees that were next to it, heading up this ridge, this was a big, big boy. And I followed this with my binoculars, and I watched this thing. I lost it at a certain point. I couldn't actually see it. And once again, this thing looked different than the one that I saw before when I was on the trail in the dark. Even though I couldn't see really get a good view of it, I could just see it through the foliage. And it was dark outside, and all I had was the light of a headlamp. But the fur that I saw that morning heading into the woods was very, very dark. Now, this creature that I was looking at in the daylight, in the afternoon, it did have kind of a dark brown fur, but there were highlights of red in it. Almost reminded me of an orangutan or King Kong from King Kong versus Godzilla from the 60s. Its whole body wasn't vibrantly colored like that, but it had these hues to it. I don't know how else to describe it, but it was kind of a brownish red hair. And the hair, it was long and stringy and matted in places. And, you could see how big this thing was underneath the fur. When it moved, you could see its muscle definition and stuff like that. And at a certain point, it was moving up the ridge, and I lost sight of it. And then I took my binoculars back over to where the deer was, and the deer was gone as well. But then I kind of kept watching that ridge, and I could see the foliage moving, like something was moving through the brush up that ridge. And I followed it as long as I could, and that's all that, that I saw of that particular encounter. I didn't hear the deer giving out any distress calls. I didn't see anything go down, so I don't know if it actually was after that deer, or if it got the deer, or if it lost the deer. But to me, and I'm a hunter myself, watching this thing, it definitely seemed to be hunting this deer. And it was a little further away. I mean, it was a lot further away than the other one that I had encountered. I didn't smell anything this time, but it was just massive, the size of this thing. And when we see things like this, obviously there's a certain part of the unknown that is frightening to us, so it does cause a certain fear response. But I never really felt terrified or anything. Like, I mean, there was the initial fear just of coming across something unknown. But any of the times I saw these things, I never really felt scared. I mean, there was that time on the trail. I mean, but it was dark. I couldn't see what it was. It was big, I mean, that's nightmare fuel for anybody. I was scared there, and obviously I didn't want to go back immediately or even by myself. But so I lied a little bit. I was scared by that encounter. But the whooping, the tree stand encounter, it felt like part of nature to me. I don't know. And I believe that these creatures are out there, and I believe that they need to be protected. They're doing a really fine job on their own, protecting themselves. But I'm just curious if one of these days there's going to come a day when it does finally, come to light scientifically that these things are out there. It's fascinated me for most of my life, learning about these things. And, as I said before, there are, even more wild accounts of these things being connected to UFOs, which I've had encounters with. Some people say they're from other dimensions. There's all kinds of things, that they have psychic links that they can connect with us. That would have been really cool. I would have really loved to have had an encounter like that where I could have talked with one. But we moved away from Switzerland County in the year 1999, and we kept going back there to go hunting throughout the years. But eventually, I can't remember what year it was. Well, I think I had moved out at that point. I was grown, and I wasn't going hunting with my dad anymore. So I've not been out there since I was 19, probably. I'm really curious as to why I'm the only one who's ever had any encounters out there. Like I said before, there's dozens of people in and out of those woods at any given point in the year. And I'm really curious as to why no one else has seen or heard anything. Or maybe they have. Maybe they were, like me when I was younger, too embarrassed to talk about it. I didn't want my dad or any of his friends to know that I saw Bigfoot. They would have laughed me right out of camp. But looking back on it now, I'm really curious as to who else has had encounters out there. My dad doesn't go out there anymore. He lives in Florida now. And as far as any of his other friends that hunted out there, the last I knew, out of a handful of like 5 or 6 guys, there was only one other guy hunting out there, and he hadn't been out there for years. It's a whole different situation out there now, and I don't even know if I would be allowed to hunt out there if I contacted them nowadays. Not without paying dues, but I don't know. It's a part of my past. I spent a lot of great times out there growing up when I was a kid. A lot of great bonding memories with my dad and stuff like that. But when I was by myself, I saw some things out in those woods that I, to this day, can't explain. And if you ask me, there's only one answer, and that's Bigfoot. And that's my story.
Well, that's it for tonight's show. If you've had a Bigfoot sighting and would like to be a guest, please go to mybigfootsighting.com and let us know. Thanks for listening. Have a great night.
Seen a bunch of rundown no-horse towns where the church is the backbone, loves in the plow, and the 5-string melodies grooving, with the farmland rows where the roots run deep, beyond the noise of the busy streets, where the songs of the South are soothing. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Yeah, the sound of a memory brings me back to the bluegrass playing on my dad's 8-track. It's pick up, man, had been through it, getting through the day on Scruggs and Skags, booking 8 bales to those Tennessee jams. There's no other way that I'd do it. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Yeah. Something going backwards in double time, getting in the soul and the tremolo Kentucky style. Those are the anthems strumming out, country boy living. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Pace of the city life drives me wild. The only tune is the cars rushing by, with the bass on the stereos booming. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Yeah. Something going backwards in double time, getting in the soul and the tremolo Kentucky style. Those are the anthems strumming out, country boy living. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm ringing out, I don't run from banjo music. Something going backwards in double time, getting in the soul and the tremolo Kentucky style. Those are the anthems strumming out, country boy living. When I hear the front porch picking down, home rhythm, fried chicken, porch swing, mama's best sweet tea kind of sound.